Hello. Thanks everyone so much for joining us for this session. Yeah, this is going to be a Q&A. So the focus is going to be on kind of a more informal conversation with Professor Winters. And I'll also be looking at the swap card chat to kind of give the audience kind of opportunities to ask questions as well, in addition to ones that I've prepared. Christoph is an assistant professor of legal philosophy at the Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de Mexico and a visiting scholar in psychology at Harvard University. He's also the founder and director of the Legal Priorities Project, an independent global research project founded by researchers from Harvard. They conduct legal research that tackles the world's most pressing problems. Winter's current research focuses on the very long-term consequences of law and legal systems, with emphasis on the challenges posed by advanced AI and the protection of future generations more generally. And I am also slightly biased, given that I will be serving as one of Legal Priorities fellows this summer. So I also think they're a great organization, are doing some cool work. And sorry for butchering the pronunciation of that Mexican university, but I probably should practice that. Okay. So let's start with just kind of a first question of kind of how did the Legal Priorities Project get started, and kind of what do you kind of view as its mission, kind of beyond that kind of short summary of doing research into these most pressing problems?
Yeah. So the short version is pretty much getting convinced of long-termism and then thinking about what I could actually contribute, and then ending. Sorry?
I was just trying to pull up the stream so that I could see the chat, but you're good.
Okay. Yeah. Short version is basically just me being convinced about long-termism and then thinking, what could I contribute? Where would I like to work? And I thought like would be a fun idea to continue to do research, but maybe now with people together who are also long-termists, but do have some knowledge about law. And so it was very tough to find an organization like that. And then the best idea seems to be to found one yourself. The longer version is much more complicated. There's obviously lots of doubts and uncertainty about what kind of research projects you should really be focusing on, or whether to found something like that in the first place. I started writing down research questions more from a general EA perspective, not necessarily specific long-termist perspective, roughly 5 years ago or so, and then taught a bunch of related courses like law and happiness, law and intuition, law and governance of AI, and these kinds of things, to see what questions may not only be important, but which questions would also resonate with people, or what kind of framing would resonate with people as well. And then over time, this developed into like some sort of a research agenda, which I then shared with a bunch of people, including Eric Martinez and Colin O'Keefe. And we all then got a bit more excited about it, got our first grant, while all being in this EA group at Harvard Law School, and eventually moved towards just focusing on long-termism rather than a general EA approach, even though there's not a general EA approach in law. There are some things which are starting out, which are including some research groups or reading groups at Oxford, which are taking a general EA approach to law, which I think is really great. But we focus primarily on long-termism. And then over the past year, we have been developing our research agenda primarily from a long-termist perspective. And after receiving the first grants, people got more excited and so on and so forth. And then the last year was a lot of work, but also a lot of fun. And so with regards to our mission, it would just be to focus on the most pressing issues by the means of legal research. And that leads us to focusing on the protection of the long-term future.
Great. Yeah, I guess kind of like what were some of the kind of problems or challenges that you kind of ran into initially, kind of forming the organization, and kind of anything that was unexpected, just kind of logistically moving from having these research that you wanted to work on in this group of people? And just random aside, but Colin is actually the person who got me into AI policy research. So he's a great guy. But anyway, so yeah, any kind of unexpected things or problems and challenges that you ran into when LPP?
I'm not sure whether it counts as an unexpected problem. Maybe the degree was unexpected, but since we are focusing on essentially global problems, but we also focus with regards to our methodology on legal research, which is a very national based field. It's not always clear whether you should focus on international law versus national law of a specific jurisdiction. That has been a bit more difficult to figure out with regards to what are the criteria for selecting, or what are good heuristics to selecting which approach one should take. The fact that law is so different across the world, and it's also so differently taught, makes it a bit more challenging than I think it would be in other fields. Whereas in science is the same in Germany or in the US or Mexico or wherever. But law is actually very different. If somebody solves the case of X in the US, that doesn't have any meaning for people in Mexico or Zimbabwe. And so, given that also legal education evolved around the law, education systems vary a lot more than in other fields. So in the US, as you know, law is a graduate study. I think in Canada as well. But outside the US and Canada, it's very rare. In vast majority of countries, law is an undergraduate study. And even within undergraduate studies, it differs quite a lot, not only with regards to like civil versus common law, but also with regards to what kind of methods people actually learn throughout their studies. I think on average in common law jurisdictions, law is taught in a more interdisciplinary way, where you question like, is it a good law, is it a bad law, what kind of effects does this law have on the people? Whereas in quite a lot of civil law countries, law is taught primarily by teaching about doctrinal analysis. And so people from around the world, since we're a global research center, bring in very different skills and skill sets. And so just to making people aware of this and getting them into a room and so that they're able to talk to each other, even though they studied the same thing, they took very different approaches. The degree of it was a bit more difficult than I thought it would be, but I think we're making really good progress. And yeah, so far it's still been working out really well.
Great. Yeah, I think I'm going to bring in some kind of questions from the audience as well that I'm seeing in the chat. So one question we have is kind of if you were this person has a brother who's a law student and is kind of trying to get more interested in EA and trying to kind of think of kind of any particular kind of examples or ideas that you kind of show the kind of like value of the intersection between law and kind of EA and long-termist ideas, because I think maybe kind of I clearly myself believe that there are a lot of intersections, but I think they can sometimes be non-obvious if you're not familiar with the field. So I'm wondering if you kind of have like kind of particular examples that you think are really good for kind of illustrating this overlap.
Yeah. So I think if you take an outside perspective, right, and just ask yourself, well, how the long-term future will go, or the human trajectory depends on how it is governed. And we're living in an age where communities are governed by the rule of law. Would be worthwhile to have some people who take the long-term perspective, who are actually experts on these government systems and on the laws we are designing our society with. That's a more abstract perspective. Some more concrete perspectives, like a little bit more concrete, would then be like, well, how is this society designed? A number of societies, at least some of the societies many EAs are living in are based on liberal democratic principles, separation of powers, and so on. And so if you think that maybe it's a good way to influence governments or legislators to adopt more long-termist policies, and that's where quite a few go into, or that's what quite a few organizations are focusing on, then there's this other thing, which is called the judiciary, which is extremely powerful and which is by mostly influenced by only one field, which is law, whereas the legislator, for instance, is influenced by findings in psychology and politics and philosophy and so on. Law is very much, what the judiciary is very much focused on law, and it serves a very important function within liberal democracies by upholding more particularly liberal values, much more so than democratic values, arguably. And so if you are, for instance, then become a bit more concrete again and ask yourself, well, like at least one danger is results from authoritarianism. And you look at what authoritarians do, it's one of the first things they always try to do, whether you look at now, for instance, Hungary or Poland, is they try to attack judicial independence. And so maybe that's something what you could do with regards to the setup of the system. But more concretely, it's also the case that even though it is perceived very differently in different jurisdictions, judges have discretion and quite a lot of discretion. And so depending on how they rule with regards to all kinds of aspects of balancing or proportionality or other ambiguous terms, they will be informed by ongoing research. And they will rule whether it's, for instance, proportionate to or that the lockdowns which have been decided by quite a few governments in the past year, whether this was justified or not. And then some judges come to the conclusion, no, lockdowns are, at least when you use these kinds of reasoning, they're not justified. And even though COVID doesn't pose any existential threat, there may be pandemics in the future which do pose existential threats. And so just having a judiciary which would be well informed about some of the risks, and so which is less likely to stand in the way of taking some extreme measures to protect humanity from these existential risks, would be a good thing to do. Aside from that, I think lawyers are in general, from my experience, a lot more creative when it comes to not only the interpretation of laws, but also the design of laws. When I, for instance, compare this with political scientists. And just by being aware of a number of laws in different societies across different time, you can think about options which others don't necessarily think about. So one example here would be that lots of the animal welfare people want to suggest a variety of different policies. But one thing I hear very little suggested, but which would make sense from an EA perspective, is to suggest specific policies which give you the reason why you protect animal welfare or animals more generally, which is because they're sentient. At least that should be one of the reasons, right? And I think the EU, the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union, in Article 13 mentions that it protects animals because they are sentient. If you have something like this, lawyers in the future can interpret this in order to make progressive developments with regards to its interpretation, but also to apply it to whatever turns out to be sentient. And just being aware that this might be an option to fill in is something which lawyers are aware of, but often from many other fields, you don't get these suggestions. Yeah.
Great. Yeah. And I see some more questions in the chat, but I think there's a couple other issues I want to make sure that we cover. And there will be, Christoph will be available for 30 minutes after the talk in Gathertown for a Q&A. And so if we don't make it to your question, I definitely really encourage you to ask him, because I see a lot of great points, but want to make sure we cover some other questions as well. Yeah, I guess I'm curious about kind of, for you to kind of talk about like how you think about kind of bucketing the different types of research that LPP and its affiliates focus on, and kind of some kind of specific examples of like the research projects that LPP is conducting or yourself that you think are kind of particularly illustrative. I think maybe kind of some of the examples that you talked about before maybe kind of show some of this intersection, but kind of some of the particular research projects that you think are worth highlighting.
Yeah, that makes sense. So we focus on 4 areas, which is the law and governance of artificial intelligence, and particularly advanced artificial intelligence, on synthetic biology and biorisk, institutional design, and within institutional design, slightly more on judicial decision-making. And then at last also on meta research and prioritization research, because there's still some uncertainties with regards to what are the most important problems from a long-termist perspective, which you can tackle from with the legal means or with legal research. So one example for that is, for instance, that while we do tend to rely on lots of evidence and research conducted by the EA community with regards to prioritization, sometimes it might differ. So for instance, I think that climate change on average is a bit more neglected within legal research than in other fields, which would then lead you to prioritize maybe slightly differently. And that's something we learned over the past year, that actually even within environmental law, climate law is still rather neglected, at least much more so than I would have thought previously. Yeah, so some of the research projects we have been involved in was like first setting up this, or writing down this legal priorities research agenda, which I encourage everyone to read, or also to work on some of the questions we outlined. You will always have to go a bit more deeper into some of the directions we suggest to write a paper, but I think it gives some good guidance in the first place. And then, yeah, so a recent research project was done by Renan and Leonie, who are both working with us for about a year. And they were looking at how effective it is to protect future generations via constitutional law, because many constitutions now incorporate some sort of protecting mechanism with regards to future generations and how they're framed. This might give us some insight on what is likely to work in the future and whether actually the tough challenge in many jurisdictions to change the constitution is worth taking on. But their results have rather been like, it's actually not that effective, or at least it has not been effective so far. Maybe it will be in the future, we don't know, but out of the 70 constitutions which mentioned that it is a goal or some sort of other mechanism to protect future generations within their constitution, it has been very little effective. Another research project I'm excited about is led by Nick Hallman, and he is trying to introduce the AI alignment problem, which is or has been mostly of concern to computer scientists and philosophers, to legal researchers as well. And I think that's actually a really good idea, because if you zoom out a little bit and think about what is the law concerned with and what our legal researchers are concerned with, it's kind of finding this system of values which is aligned with human preferences, which is very much the problem the AI alignment researchers face. And so it may be the case that since people are working on this for thousands of years, that lawyers can contribute something in this realm if we frame it carefully and if we frame it in a way which makes it appealing for them to work on. And so that I think is quite an important project. Maybe one last one, which is very exciting, is a survey I conducted with Eric Martinez, who's also at the Legal Priorities Project. And we asked law professors around the world on their views on prioritization and long-termism, and some questions also with regards to the adoption of AI in the judicial sector. One of the most surprising and exciting results was that hundreds of law professors, I think we had 512 law professors respond to this survey, that they thought the gap between the descriptive and normative protection of future generations was greatest across all the groups we asked them for. So we had like a bunch of questions like, how much do you think the law is protecting a specific group, like future generations, animals, humans inside the jurisdiction, outside the jurisdictions, and so on and so forth? And the gap, and then we also asked the question, how much do you think this group should be protected by the law? And the gap was biggest between a descriptive and normative positions with regards to future generations. Law professors on average actually think that future generations should roughly be protected as much as the current generation inside the jurisdiction, which is very surprising to me. And this was across the board the case. So across the world, people responded in this way. Yeah.
Yeah. This is actually a question that we had from chat that's related to it, and if this is something that you'd prefer to kind of handle after in the office hours, but if you feel up, but it seems relevant to it. So this is the question is, yeah. So if we ascribe legal rights to potential people, not just current actual people, does that have implications for kind of current debates like outlawing abortion? Which is maybe a kind of complicated and contested issue, but I'm just kind of curious for any kind of quick thoughts you have on that.
Yeah. I don't necessarily think that protecting future generation means that they should have rights. There might be all kinds of different mechanisms. We also ask all of these law professors what some of the most effective mechanisms would be. And we gave them a bunch of options. Unfortunately, the answers didn't differ a lot. I do remember that the answer, the option which they thought was the most effective response with regards to protecting future generations was just install a 1% mandatory budget of states to use for protecting future generations, to use for spending on like preventive measures against existential risks and these kinds of things. So it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to adopt the rights framing. I also think that the rights framing with regards to future generations is much less likely to be adopted. It would be much tougher to argue for that. And if it's not necessarily a lot more effective, then I would probably advise against that. But there still needs to be done a lot more research in this regards to what are the means most effective to protecting future generations, especially those in the far future.
Great, yeah. So some of our audience members might be interested in working or collaborating with the Legal Priorities Project. And I'm kind of curious if this is an option, and if so, how might they go about expressing their interest, and maybe kind of relatedly, if you could kind of talk a little bit about the LPP fellowship and kind of who this might be a good fit for.
Yeah, given that we don't have too much time anymore, we'll try to make this short. And with regards to the fellowship, there's lots more information on the website on the legalpriorities.org. And so you can inform yourself there a bit more. The one thing I would like to mention though is that even if you're not too familiar with long-termism, we do accept people who are likely to just be very aligned and find it super exciting to work on this, and who want to spend a summer on doing more exploratory things with regards to how could they contribute best to long-termism aligned research. And the second thing in this regard I want to mention is that even if you are eventually not accepted, like I wouldn't be too unhappy about that, since we do receive quite a lot of applications, and we unfortunately had to say no to some people who are just clearly qualified to do this summer fellowship. But some of them also applied then the year later again and were accepted then. And so I encourage you to still stay in touch, even if there's a chance that you won't get accepted. And then there are lots of other ways to get in touch with us. We have a Legal Priorities Lab happening almost every Friday, which we started roughly 2 months ago. And there it's like different researchers from all around the world present on what they consider to be important issues for legal research with regards to long-termism. And that's easy to get in touch with people. We also now plan to have office hours from next or the week afterwards onwards. And so that's also a very low effort way to get in touch with some of us. You can also fill out an expression of interest form on our website. So I think there are lots of ways to get in touch, and we would love to hear from anyone who's interested in these kinds of questions.
Yeah, terrific. Thanks so much for your time, Christoph.
Thanks, Nathan.